On the first day of the council meeting at the World Trade Organization, discussions on other agenda items such as reforming the WTO appellate body dragged on, and the meeting ended up addressing only 8 out of the 14 set topics for the session. Now this means the topic of Japan's export restrictions, which was 11th on that list, has been postponed to Wednesday. For more on what we can expect from the meeting as South Korea and Japan head off in Geneva, Professor Yang Jun-sok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea, joins me in the studio today. So good to see you.
Happy to be here.
All right, so now we know the discussions of Japan's export controls will be postponed at the WTO. But to start us off, what does bringing this such an issue to the WTO mean for both South Korea and Japan?
Well, it's part of a diplomatic battle, and it's setting the stage for dispute settlement later on. To put it in more detail, right now the most effective tool that Korea has is diplomatic. We have to show that Japan is not doing this for economic reasons, but because of political, historical reasons, that it's using the economic tools to try to get at the forced labor reparation during the Japanese occupation in the early half of the 20th century. So it's really using a wrong tool to do the job. So it's part of that diplomatic effort, but also the type of mood that we can see in the General Council, I think it'll be reflected in the dispute settlement mechanism when we bring this to trial later on. In WTO, trials are called dispute settlements.
Okay.
Now, we don't really want to put too much emphasis on dispute settlement because it'll take at least 15 months to 4 years to go through the process. So we would really like to have this settled earlier than that.
Right.
And the most useful tool that we have is the diplomatic tool. So this is a way to put a wide audience and to try to show that Japan is disobeying WTO free trade principles. And this might be the most effective tool that we have to show the international governments, the trade experts, that Japan is not using the GATT WTO agreements in the right way. And then we also want to try to use this as a stage for influencing not only the trade officials, but government officials that don't really have a lot to do with trade, but still can have a lot of influence, economic ministers, for example.
Now, in what specific ways, then, do you think South Korea can actually prove what you just said, that Japan is using this as a political retaliation?
Well, Japan is using GATT Article 21 as a defense. Now, what the GATT Article 21 says is that in cases of security issues, countries can not obey the GATT WTO agreements. And that, I think, is a reasonable issue because, well, security issue means the security of the country is involved, right. So that trade issues will obviously become second most important issue rather than the most important issue. But the interpretation in the WTO currently is that what you mean by security issues are usually military, dealing with wars or dealing with emergencies in international relations or things like UN sanctions. So they mention things like weaponry, they mention things that could be used to make weapons. In that sense, Japan is using perhaps the right terminology for the job, but there's also an understanding, though it's not explicitly written in the Article 21, that you have to limit yourself into those issues. And what Korea is arguing, and a lot of other international press seems to be back in Korea rather than Japan, right, is that it's not really a defense issue, it's not really a security issue, but it's trying to pressure Korea to do something about the reparation issue, that they exempt Japanese government and Japanese firms from paying any reparations to people who were affected by forced labor during the Japanese occupation. And that's partially why Japan is trying to separate the issues, or trying to, by saying that this is purely a security issue. But still, Japan seems to be having some difficulties trying to unlink those two issues.
All right, then, like you said, international media have been kind of leaning towards South Korea's side, but obviously Japan has to make its case. So how do you think it's going to persuade its WTO counselors?
Okay, well, in order to be against the WTO agreements, not only do you have to disobey the agreement, but also the other country has to receive a damage. And Japan right now can argue that Korea has not really received any damages, because what they've so far did is put Korea off the whitelist, so they're basically requiring more paperwork. Now, Japan has been giving different signals to the Western press, like Financial Times, and Asian press, or Korean press. What they've been saying to the Korean press or the Asian press is that putting Korea off the whitelist is the first step. They're seriously considering limiting the exports of these crucial chemicals as well as other goods that could be on the whitelist. On the other hand, the signals that they're giving in interviews to places like Financial Times is saying, well, we're requiring more paperwork because we're no longer sure about Korea, but if they get the paperwork and if they're in order and if they're passed, why shouldn't we export these chemicals to Japan?
Right.
So they're arguing that they're just requiring more paperwork and requiring more time, but it shouldn't affect the amount of exports that will go to Korea. So because the paperwork takes typically 1 month to 3 months, and it's about 1 month since Japan has required these paperwork for the 3 crucial chemicals, we're not sure whether there is damage. Based on what Japanese officials said to Asian press, we think there will be damage, but right now there's no numbers to prove it.
Right.
So Japan right now has room to prove that there hasn't been damages. And then secondly, as I mentioned before, they need to show that this is purely a security issue, that the Japanese reparations for forced labor has nothing to do with it. Korea, on the other hand, has to show that, well, even if there's no current damage, there's a lot of potential for future damage.
Right.
And then the cause for the getting Korea off the whitelist is not security issues. Korea's doing fine on security issues, but it's rather that reparation issue. So that's what Korea has to prove, that's what Japan has to prove. And the interesting thing about WTO, well, the General Council is a diplomatic stage, so you have to prove, the other side have to prove their point anyway, but under the dispute settlement mechanism, when we go to trial, burden of proof is on both sides. So this is preparation for that, I think.
All right. Now, this is not the first time that South Korea and Japan had off in Geneva at the WTO, because last April, WTO actually, it ruled in favor of South Korea's import restrictions on Japanese fisheries products from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011. So with that under our belt, what are the chances that the WTO could rule in favor of South Korea this time?
Okay, well, we're getting into legal interpretations here. I think Korea is on a good ground saying that the cause of the controls is the reparation issue rather than the security issue. Most of the foreign press, the New York Times, Financial Times, they both think that the real cause is the reparation issue. But a bit of a difficulty here is that every country wants to retain as much freedom as possible under the security exemption. So I'm not sure if they would welcome WTO's control over what country can decide, well, these countries can be on the whitelist and what countries cannot. If there's a smoking gun, or if there's actual proof that there has been damages, they're using this to control exports for non-economic issues, then I think Korea would have a much stronger case.
Okay.
But that means we'll have to receive damages. And we don't really want that.
Right.
So that's partially why we're starting at this diplomatic stage first. Now, so I think it'll be a very difficult issue currently under Article 21, not necessarily because we don't have proof, but I don't think a lot of countries will want to give up that right to decide what is a threat to be decided by each country rather than the WTO.
Right.
Now, another factor to consider here is that a country which is abusing Article 21 very extensively right now is the United States.
Yeah.
President Trump is using the security exemption to install tariffs, not because of military issues, not because of international sanctions, but to protect its domestic industries.
Right.
So United States actually wants to maintain the blanket exemption for Article 21 quite strongly. So that's also going to be another wild card here.
All right. Well, if the WTO rules in favor or not in favor of South Korea, but I mean, what's next? What's next from here on out? I mean, would Japan be able to withdraw its restrictions against South Korea?
Okay, well, the General Counsel does not give binding orders. That's up to the dispute settlement mechanism. What it can do, though, is that it can give a lot of diplomatic pressure. And if Korea can prove that the cause of the controls was the reparation issue, then it'll make Japan really look bad in the international trade environment. Japan has recently argued in the G20 that the countries must maintain free trade. Japan itself had some problems with export controls by China in the past. So it'll actually make it more difficult for them to engage in international trade negotiations or international trade in the long run if the principle that Japan is using here is accepted. So I think Japan, well, the General Counsel cannot force Japan to put Korea back into the whitelist, but I think it may be able to stop Japan from abusing the whitelist.
Okay.
So I think right now that's the best that Korea can hope for.
Now, we know that South Korea's trade minister is actually in Washington to meet with U.S. economics and trade experts to highlight that what Japan is doing is going to hurt not only the South Korean economy, but the global economy as well. So what can we expect from this?
Okay, well, right now, another issue is that, well, John Bolton is in Korea. And as I mentioned, President Trump really likes abusing the Article 21.
And his America First policies,
So
right?
I think using the WTO argument in the U.S. is not going to have much effect. What's going to have much more effect is that this is going to affect the security issue. President Trump, Mr. Bolton, is much more interested in North Korea nuclear issue, the standoff and balance of power between China and the United States. So we should emphasize what can happen on that front. And then there's economic damage to American firms. Korea exports a lot of semiconductors. Korea takes 70% of memory chips, 90% of display semiconductors. So if Korea production is reduced, that's going to have serious effect on not only Korean firms, but also firms in the United States and even Japan. So I think rather than stress legal issues, they should first stress on security issues, then economic harm to the United States, and then they can even bring up moral issue. It might not work with the Trump administration. It may work with the United States Congress like it did with the comfort women issue, but tell them why Koreans are so angry. A lot of American lawmakers don't really understand that, well, because this is almost 100 years ago.
Right.
And Korean history is not exactly studied a lot in global history. So they may be either unfamiliar with it completely, or even if they know the issue, they don't really know the emotional content of what Koreans feel. So if we can convince them morally why Koreans are so angry, then I think that could have a big impact on diplomatic fight between Japan and Korea.
All right. So then what kind of countermeasures do you think the South Korean government could come up with, considering that Japan could possibly expand its export restrictions?
Well, in the very short term, the only tool we really have are diplomatic. We want to pressure Japan to ideally get Korea back on the white list. I don't think that's going to be possible. I think that's going to be very difficult. But still, that's the best we can hope for. But then I think realistically, if Japan puts Korea off the white list, we have to make sure that they don't abuse the white list to restrict exports to Korea. So I think one thing that we can do is, well, if you look at the GATT agreement, there's what's called general exemptions, the cases where you don't have to maintain all the rules of the GATT agreement. That's in Article 20. And one of the conditions that they have is that if there's a shortage in supply, then Korea can restrict exports.
Okay.
And perhaps I don't want to use it. I don't think we should use it, but put out a contingency plan so that if Japan does reduce the exports of these chemicals, and if Korean semiconductor production is reduced, then we will set up an export quota with semiconductors going this percentage to here, this percentage to there, and make sure that Japan doesn't get a whole lot of it.
All right.
Now, this should not be used because this is a contingency plan, and it's a type of strategy that I think EU, China, and even the United States uses when they're hit with higher tariffs. Then they announce that if you don't reduce the tariffs, we're going to put counter tariffs on these goods. And what they do is that in the other country, with the industries where they'll be affected, they'll start lobbying their own government to try to reduce the effect of the trade war. And I think that's what we need to do.
Okay.
So this is a tool that actually should not be used. But it gives a clear indication that if Japan does carry out with the threat, then Japan will be affected as well.
Right.
And hopefully they'll get the Japanese firms themselves to start lobbying the government to try to reduce the effect of this war.
Okay. Well, I guess for now we'll have to keep our eyes on what comes out of this WTO meeting. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you right back here at the same time tomorrow.